Let me tell you something about pain, real pain. The kind that reshapes a nervous system, and it's counterintuitive. So stay with me. You'd think the most painful rejection for a dismissive avoidant would be the big dramatic one, the blow up, the betrayal, the public humiliation. But it's not. It's quieter than that. It's smaller than that. And it's more devastating than anything loud could ever be. Here's what nobody tells you. The deepest wound isn't being rejected for who you're pretending to. It's being rejected for who you actually are. Think about that for a second. A dismissive avoidant spends years, sometimes decades, constructing a version of themselves that doesn't need anything from anyone. Competent, independent, unbothered, that's the performance, that's the shield. And on some level, they know it's a shield. So when someone rejects the performance, it doesn't really touch them. They can rationalize it. They didn't even know the real me. Clean exit, no damage. But every once in a while, and this is the moment I want you to really sit with, every once in a while, someone gets past the shield, someone sees the fear underneath the competence. Someone sees the little kid who learned a long time ago that needing people was dangerous, that closeness came with a cost, that the safest move was always self-reliance. And that person doesn't run. They stay. They look right at that raw, unguarded truth. And then they leave anyway. That's the moment. That's the one that rewires everything. Because now there's no story to tell yourself. No mask to blame. The armor did its job. It let someone in, and the verdict came back. Still not enough. Not the performance, not the strategy, the actual unfiltered them. And here's the psychological trap, the thing that makes this so cruel. The entire avoidance strategy was built to prevent exactly this outcome. Stay guarded, stay independent, stay one step removed, and you'll never have to find out the answer to the question that terrifies you most. Am I lovable when I stop performing? That rejection doesn't just hurt, it answers the question. And the answer feels like confirmation of something they suspected their whole life. Now, I want you to notice something, because this is where the philosophy comes in. Pain, like this isn't actually about the other person, it's about what the moment reveals. Rejection is just information, but this particular flavor of rejection lands directly on the oldest wound in the room, the belief formed early, reinforced often, that authenticity is a liability, that the true self is something to manage, not something to offer. And that's exactly why this rejection cuts deeper than any conflict, any argument, any dramatic ending ever could, because it's not an attack from the outside. It's an echo of something that was already whispered on the inside years before this person ever showed up. So here's what I want you to take with you as we go deeper into this today. The most painful rejections in life are never about being seen and misunderstood. They're about being seen clearly, completely, and still let go. And once you understand that, you understand the real work isn't building a better mask. It's learning to survive being truly known. Now let's go one layer deeper. Because if point one was about being seen and still left, point two is about something even more unsettling. What happens when the very strategy designed to protect you becomes the thing that fails you? Here's the mechanism most people miss. The dismissive avoidant doesn't wake up one day and decide to be distant. Nobody chooses that consciously. What happens is much more intelligent and much more tragic than that. Somewhere early on, in a home, in a moment, in 1,000 small moments, a decision got made below the level of conscious thought. Connection is unreliable, so control is safer than closeness. And from that decision, an entire architecture gets built. Independence isn't just a personality trait, it's engineering. It's a survival system. And like any good survival system, it works. That's the part we have to be honest about. It works. It gets you through childhood. It gets you through relationships that would have destroyed someone without it. It lets you function, achieve, perform, succeed, all while quietly making sure nobody gets close enough to confirm the fear underneath. So when rejection comes for a dismissive avoidant, it's rarely a rejection of behavior. Nobody's really rejecting the promotions, the composure, the competence. What's actually happening, and this is the part that should stop you in your seat, is that the rejection is landing on the system itself, not the person's actions, the strategy, the architecture, the thing they built their entire identity around trusting. Think about what that means psychologically. If you reject my behavior, I can adjust my behavior. I can apologize, change, improve. That's manageable. That's within my control. But if the rejection proves that my lifelong strategy, the one I bet everything on, doesn't actually protect me, where do I go from there? What do I even trust anymore? This is why so many dismissive avoidants describe a particular kind of devastation that doesn't look like sadness from the outside. It looks like shutdown. It looks like confusion. It looks like disbelief. Because on some unconscious level, they weren't just losing a relationship, they were watching the entire operating system of their life throw an error it was never supposed to throw. And here's the philosophical truth sitting underneath all of this. Every psychological strategy we build to protect ourselves has a hidden limit. We rarely see that limit until life pushes us right up against it. The armor that kept you safe at 7 years old was never designed for the intimacy you're capable of at 35. It's outdated software running critical systems. And when it finally fails, when the self-sufficiency doesn't self-sufficient its way out of the pain, that failure feels less like heartbreak and more like an identity crisis. That's the real story behind point 2. It's not I did something wrong and got rejected. It's the thing I trusted most to keep me safe just proved it can't. And that revelation is far more disorienting than any single loss, because it doesn't just take away a person, it takes away your map. So here's what I want you to remember as we move forward. The strategies that once saved you are not obligated to keep saving you forever. And the moment you discover that isn't the end of your story. It's the first honest chapter of it. Let's talk about weapons for a second. Not physical ones, psychological ones. Because every one of us, whether we admit it or not, carries a weapon we reach for when we feel threatened in connection. And for the dismissive avoidant, that weapon has always been distance, silence. The quiet exit before the messy conversation even starts. Here's why that matters. And here's where it gets almost poetic in its cruelty. What happens when someone uses your own weapon against you? Think about how the avoidance strategy actually functions in conflict. Someone gets too close, conversation gets too intense, needs get too loud, and the avoidant doesn't fight. They don't yell, they pull back, they go quiet, they create space. And that space isn't empty, it's functional, it's a release valve. It's how they regulate an internal alarm system that's been ringing since childhood. Distance, for them, has always been safety. It's the one move that has never failed. So now imagine, really imagine what happens when the person on the other side learns to do the same thing. When they stop chasing. When they stop initiating the hard conversation. When they too go quiet. Suddenly, there is no scene to manage, no argument to strategically exit, no emotional intensity to escape from. There's just absence. Mutual, silent, suffocating absence. And here's the psychological trap nobody talks about. An argument, as painful as it is, actually gives the avoidant something to work with. There's information in conflict, there's data, you know where you stand, you know what's being asked of you, and most importantly, you know exactly how to retreat from it. But silence gives you nothing to retreat from. You can't create distance from someone who has already created it first. Your own escape route has just been closed off by someone using your exact blueprint. This is where the fear underneath the fear reveals itself. Because the dismissive avoidant isn't actually afraid of closeness the way people assume. What they're truly terrified of is being unwanted without warning, being left in a way so quiet, so undramatic, that there's no moment to defend against it, no signal to respond to, no conflict to resolve their way out of. Silence doesn't attack the armor. It simply walks past it like it was never there to begin with. And philosophically, this reveals something profound about the nature of emotional strategies. In general, a defense mechanism only works when the other person hasn't learned your language. The moment somebody speaks your own dialect of self-protection back to you, it stops being safety and becomes exposure. That's not weakness on their part, that's mastery. And it forces the avoidant to confront, often for the first time, that the very tool they've relied on their whole life to prevent pain is now the exact instrument delivering it. This is why so many dismissive avoidants describe certain breakups not as painful, but as haunting. Not loud, not explosive, just a slow, cold realization that the silence they always controlled has now been turned back on them, and this time they're on the receiving end of it. So here's the truth I want you to carry forward. The tools we use to protect ourselves are not neutral. They teach the people around us how to eventually reach us or how to finally leave us. And silence, when it finally speaks, says more than any argument ever could. Now I want to talk about the price of a single moment of courage. Because for a dismissive avoidant, vulnerability isn't a habit. It isn't a Tuesday, it's an event. And events like that come at a cost most people never calculate. Understand something about how rare this actually is. For most people, opening up is uncomfortable, but survivable. A risk taken among many risks in an ordinary emotional life. But for someone wired for dismissive avoidance, vulnerability isn't just uncomfortable. It's a violation of the core operating principle, never let the guard down completely. Because the guard is the only thing standing between you and unbearable exposure. So when it finally happens, when they say the thing they weren't supposed to say, ask for the thing they weren't supposed to need. Show the fear they've spent a lifetime hiding. That's not a small moment. That is, psychologically speaking, one of the most expensive acts of their entire life. And here's what most people don't understand about expensive acts. The cost isn't paid at the moment of the act, it's paid in what happens right after. If rejection lands in that exact window right after the walls came down, right after the risk was taken, it doesn't just hurt, it teaches. And the lesson it teaches is devastating in its efficiency. You see, this is exactly why you don't do that. One data point, one moment, and an entire belief system gets reinforced with the force of 100 smaller experiences combined. This is where I want you to think about the architecture of belief itself, because this matters far beyond attachment theory. The human mind doesn't need repeated evidence to lock in a conclusion. It needs decisive evidence. And nothing is more decisive to a guarded nervous system than proof arriving in the exact moment it was most afraid of being right. It's not sometimes vulnerability goes badly, it becomes vulnerability goes badly, full stop. Case closed. Lesson learned, even though the lesson is wrong. And here's the tragedy hiding underneath that tragedy. The rejection itself might have had nothing to do with the vulnerability at all. Timing is cruel that way. Relationships end for 1,000 reasons. Incompatibility, circumstance, timing, growth in different directions. But the dismissive avoidance mind doesn't process it that way in the moment. It collapses the timeline. It fuses the vulnerability and the loss into a single cause and effect story, because that's what a threatened nervous system does. It looks for the fastest possible explanation that keeps you safe next time. So the walls don't just go back up after that, they go up reinforced, thicker, better defended, because now there's proof. Now there's a case study. Now there's a memory to point to every single time future vulnerability starts to feel possible. Again, this is the philosophical heartbreak at the center of point 4. The moments that could heal us and the moments that wound us often look identical from the outside. Courage and catastrophe can happen in the very same breath. And when they do, most people don't remember the courage, they only remember the catastrophe. So here's what I want you to hold on to. Just because vulnerability was followed by pain doesn't mean vulnerability was the mistake. Sometimes the bravest moment of your life gets buried under the worst possible timing, and mistaking one for the other is how a single wound becomes a lifelong wall. Don't let one moment write the whole story. It was never supposed to end the book. Let's talk about a defense mechanism. So subtle, most people never notice they're using it. Devaluation, because here's a survival trick the dismissive avoidant masters early. If someone rejects you and you can quietly convince yourself they were never that impressive to begin with, the rejection stops being about you, it becomes about them, their limitations, their lack of vision, their inability to appreciate what they had. It's a clean escape hatch and it works beautifully right up until it doesn't, because here's what happens when the rejection comes from someone you actually respect, someone whose judgment you trust, someone whose opinion carries weight in your mind, not because you love them, but because you saw something in them worth measuring yourself against. That escape hatch quietly welds itself shut. Think about the psychology of respect for a moment, because it's different from the psychology of love. Love can be irrational, chaotic, impossible to explain, but respect is earned through evidence. You respect someone because you've watched them think clearly, act with integrity, show competence you recognize as real. And when a person like that looks at you, truly looks, and decides to walk away, you cannot dismiss their verdict as easily as you dismiss a stranger's opinion. Their judgment has credibility. And credibility is exactly what makes this kind of rejection so much harder to deflect. Here's the deeper trap. The dismissive avoidant's entire emotional survival often depends on being able to control the narrative after a loss. If I can decide you weren't right for me, weren't perceptive enough, weren't operating on my level, I get to keep my self-concept intact. I lose the relationship, but I keep the story where I'm still the competent one. The discerning one, the one who dodged something, that story is armor, but it only works if the other person is someone you can look down on even a little. Take away that option. Put someone in front of them whose intelligence, values, and perception they've already privately admired, and the whole narrative collapses. There's no one left to blame in the story, no flaw in the other person's judgment to point to, just the uncomfortable possibility that someone sharp, someone credible, someone worth respecting looked closely and decided to leave anyway. And this is where the deeper wound reveals itself. It's not simply I was rejected, it's I was rejected by someone whose opinion I would have trusted about almost anything else in my life. So why would I stop trusting it about me? That's a philosophical crisis disguised as heartbreak, because now the rejection doesn't feel like a difference of compatibility. It feels like a verdict from a credible witness. This connects directly to everything we've already uncovered today. The fear of being truly seen, the failure of the self-protective strategy, the silence turned inward, the vulnerability punished by timing. This is simply the final layer when the person delivering the pain is someone you can't quietly diminish. The rejection stops being deflectable. It becomes data you can't argue with, at least not without lying to yourself. So here's the truth I want you to sit with. Not every verdict deserves to be treated as final, no matter how credible the judge. Respecting someone's mind does not obligate you to accept their conclusion about your worth. Their opinion of you was never the whole truth. It was only ever one perspective. And you are always allowed to seek a second opinion, starting with your own. Now we arrive at the final layer, and I want to warn you, this one is the heaviest because this is the rejection that comes with no one else to blame. Everything we've talked about today involves someone else's choice, someone else seeing them and leaving someone else's strategy failing them, someone else's silence, someone else's timing, someone else's credible verdict. But this last one is different. This one turns inward because sometimes the most painful rejection a dismissive avoidant ever experiences isn't something that was done to them. It's something they did to themselves. Let me walk you through how this actually unfolds because it rarely announces itself in the moment. It arrives late, sometimes months later, sometimes years later in a quiet flash of clarity that hits like a physical blow. The withdrawal, the distance, the emotional unavailability that felt so necessary at the time, that wasn't protection at all. That was the thing that pushed away the one person who actually stayed, the one person who didn't flinch at the walls, the one person who kept showing up, kept trying, kept choosing them until eventually even they couldn't do it anymore. And here's what makes this particular pain so uniquely brutal. There's no external villain to process it through, no one to be angry at, no one else's flaw to point to, no timing to blame, no credibility to question, just a mirror, just the slow sinking recognition that the exit wasn't forced upon them. It was built brick by their own hands, using the exact tools they thought were keeping them safe. This is where psychology bleeds into something closer to philosophy, because we're no longer talking about a wound inflicted by another person. We're talking about the particular agony of retrospective clarity, seeing a decision correctly only after the window to change it has already closed. There's a reason this kind of regret cuts deeper than almost anything else in human experience. It's not grief over what happened to you. It's grief over what you had the power to do differently and didn't. And notice something important here, because it ties every single point we've covered today into one unified truth. The dismissive avoidant spends so much energy protecting themselves from being hurt by others that they rarely stop to ask a much harder question. What if I'm the variable causing my own pain? What if the common denominator in every version of this story, the walking away, the silence, the guarded heart, isn't circumstance? What if it's a pattern I keep choosing before I even realize I'm choosing it? That question is uncomfortable. It's supposed to be, but it's also the most liberating question in this entire speech. Because everything else we've discussed today, being truly seen, the failure of the armor, the silence turned around, the vulnerability punished by timing, the credible verdict, all of that involved forces partially outside their control. This one doesn't, and that means this is the one place where change is actually possible. Not by becoming someone who never feels fear, not by dismantling every wall overnight, but by finally seeing the pattern clearly enough to interrupt it before it costs another connection worth keeping. So here's what I want you to leave with today. The most painful rejection isn't always the one that happens to you. Sometimes it's the one you spend years running from, only to discover when you finally turn around that you were running from yourself the entire time. So let's bring this all the way home, because everything I've shared with you today isn't just a list of painful moments, it's a map of one nervous system's long, exhausting attempt to survive love without ever fully risking it. We started with the moment someone sees you completely and leaves anyway, proof, or so it feels, that the true self isn't enough. We moved into the collapse of the very strategy built to prevent that pain, the armor failing at the exact moment it mattered most. We watched silence become a weapon turned back on its own creator. We witnessed courage punished by timing, one moment of vulnerability calcifying into a lifetime of walls. We stood in front of a rejection too credible to deflect, delivered by someone whose judgment couldn't be dismissed. And finally, we arrived at the hardest truth of all, the realization that sometimes the door wasn't closed by someone else's hand. It was closed by our own, one quiet retreat at a time. 6 different wounds. But underneath all 6, one single truth keeps surfacing again and again. The pain was never really about being unlovable. It was about the terrifying possibility of finding out. And here's what I need you to understand before you walk out of this room today. A strategy that protected a frightened child does not have to govern the life of a capable adult. The walls that once made sense don't get to make every decision for the rest of your story unless you let them, because the truth is this: you can respect where your armor came from without spending the rest of your life wearing it into every room you enter. You can honor the survival instinct that got you here and still choose right now in this moment to want something more than survival. You can want connection. You can want to be known. You can want to stay in the room after the vulnerability instead of quietly building the exit before anyone even asks you to leave. That is the real work, not becoming fearless. Nobody becomes fearless. The real work is becoming someone who can feel the fear, recognize it for what it is, an old alarm system misreading a present day moment, and choose differently anyway. So if any part of what I said today felt uncomfortably familiar, if you recognized yourself in the silence, in the armor, in the walls that went up right after you finally let them down, I want you to hear this clearly, that recognition is not a life sentence. It's an invitation, because the moment you can finally see the pattern is the exact same moment you stop being controlled by it. You are not the walls you built to survive your past. You are the person still standing here right now, capable of tearing them down on your own terms and finally letting someone in all the way without waiting for the moment you'll have to run. That is the real most painful rejection of all, not the one someone else gave you, the one you keep giving yourself. Every single day you choose the wall over the connection. So today, choose differently.